Welcome, traveler of strange stories and forgotten truths. Tonight's tale is different from the rest. Tonight, we step behind velvet curtains and stone walls, into the quiet, hidden corners of life in the Middle Ages. Before we begin, take a moment, breathe deeply. Relax your shoulders, let your eyes close gently, and drift into the calm of another time. If you find comfort in this journey through the shadows of the past, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who also finds peace in the unknown. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? I love seeing where history reaches. Now, let's begin. The Middle Ages were far from romantic, not the soft, candlelit kind you find in stories today. They were raw, intense, filled with smoke, sweat, decay, and quiet desperation. Intimacy was not about pleasure. It was a form of power, expectation, belief, and control. It was part of the social fabric, and it started early. Childhood in medieval villages was not wrapped in innocence. There were no walls shielding children from the world's realities. They witnessed the cycle of life plainly: birth, growth, loss. Sounds came through wooden walls, unfiltered. Children learned quickly. Puberty arrived not with gentle change, but with a shift in purpose. Not just hormones, but responsibility. For the church, for family, for society. A girl's first period was not celebrated with joy. It was met with silence, caution, or unease. It meant she was now seen differently. Legally, in many places, 12 was the age when decisions were made for her contracts, marriage arrangements, futures planned without her voice. Marriage was often a transaction between families, where bodies became part of alliances and agreements. Virginity was important. Proof was expected. Expectations around the wedding night where strict bed linens were observed, stories whispered. If there was no sign, consequences followed: shame, doubt, or worse. Sometimes, those tasked with confirming a bride's status were officials whose actions would feel unacceptable today, but were recorded as part of routine. And if a woman was not considered a virgin, society offered two paths: acceptance or rejection. Prostitution was widespread. Cities like London, Paris, and Prague had official areas for it, marked and sometimes regulated by laws. Women working in these places often faced hardship and danger. But there was also a hierarchy. Some women were skilled in conversation, art, even politics, offering more than company. They offered influence. Men paid not only for companionship, but for a sense of respect, even power. Yet medieval intimacy was far from safe. Condoms existed but were rare and costly, made from natural materials soaked in herbal mixtures. Most did not use protection. Diseases spread rapidly, illnesses that caused suffering, lasting effects, and sometimes death. And still, the cycle continued. Because it was expected. Because refusing was often not an option, especially for women. Wives were legally their husband's property, with little say in their own lives. Marital relations were enforced. A woman refusing her husband could face punishment or pressure from community and clergy. On the other hand, desire, especially female desire, was viewed with suspicion. Women showing enjoyment could be accused of witchcraft or worse. Inquisitors wrote about these fears, describing women's bodies in ways that justified control and punishment. These were warnings, meant to silence and discipline. Men faced their own pressures. Masturbation was called sinful and shameful, leading to rituals of penance and strict self-discipline. Monks wrote of their struggles with temptation in diaries of confession and restraint. In the Middle Ages, intimacy was not simply personal. It was entwined with belief, power, and survival. It was a space where purity and taboo met, and no one escaped unchanged. In the market, who was noticed for too long? Not the nobleman who visited places of gathering as part of ritual. Not the priest who preached restraint by day and had private struggles at night. No one. Because the Middle Ages were a time of deep caution. About behavior, about roles, about expectations. This caution shaped daily life. Stories helped explain experiences beyond words, blending faith and tradition. These stories influenced how people thought about themselves and their place in the world. Children learned early to observe and follow rules. Boys and girls alike were guided carefully. Behavior was either proper or respected, with clear expectations for everyone. In village churches, priests recorded important life events and listened to personal concerns. They offered guidance and support, helping people reflect on their actions and thoughts. Manuals helped priests in their role as advisors, focusing on understanding and care. The church encouraged balance and discipline. Those who struggled were offered various forms of support: herbal remedies, fasting, prayers. People carried symbols of their commitments. Guidance was given to help maintain calm and focus. While ideals were set, real life often had complexities. Leaders sometimes lived differently in private than in public. Families arranged partnerships early, and private relationships coexisted quietly. Speaking openly of such matters was uncommon. Women had important responsibilities throughout life. Midwives were respected experts, sharing knowledge passed through generations. Childbirth was challenging, and sometimes rumors or misunderstandings occurred. The idea of modesty was important and symbolized in various ways, sometimes through objects representing respect and restraint. Traditions encouraged discretion and honor. Across regions, women often covered their hair and showed humility, not always by choice, but by social custom. Beliefs held that presence and behavior mattered deeply. Illness and health were understood within these cultural views, with varied approaches to care. The culture of the Middle Ages emphasized respect, tradition, and social harmony. It defined roles and expectations, marking distinctions between public and private life, modesty and honor, silence and expression. Still, people sought connection and expression. They found quiet ways to share feelings in poetry, symbols, and shared moments. Because human spirit and feelings persist through time, even when gently guided by custom. It doesn't die, it reshapes itself. It hides in lullabies, in prayers, in eyes that meet for 1 second too long, and that terrified them, not because it was evil, but because it couldn't be owned. And now, centuries later, we read their letters, their trial records, their confessions written in trembling ink. And what do we find? Not monsters, not saints, but people aching, ashamed, curious, afraid, and sometimes defiantly human. And then there were the punishments, not whispered rumors, but public rituals, where bodies were turned into theater, where X was dragged into daylight and made into spectacle. A woman accused of adultery might be stripped, shaved, marched through town with iron weights tied to her ankles, not to correct her, but to display her, to remind others what flesh deserved when it disobeyed. In France, it was not uncommon to brand the letter A onto her skin, not in metaphor, but in metal. Heated until it hissed against her collarbone. Sometimes she was paraded on a donkey, facing backward. Sometimes with a wooden yoke clamped around her neck. The townsfolk watched, not in horror, but with satisfaction. Because punishment was entertainment, morality was a show, and the lives of others were fuel for collective virtue. Men too faced shame, though differently caught in sodomy. They were hanged or drowned or burned alive. Some were castrated, not just in secret, but in public squares, the crowd chanting prayers while flesh was severed, and no one looked away, because they had been taught that looking away was complicity, and complicity was sin. And so they stared, children included. They learned what happened to those who strayed from sanctioned desire, and yet those same crowds visited brothels, bribed priests, arranged marriages between cousins, and forced girls into convents not for faith, but to hide pregnancies. It was not about purity, it was about control, about hierarchy, about silencing what could not be understood. And if the church could not silence it, they'd at least reframe it, twisting ancient pagan traditions into warnings, creating tales of succubi female demons who seduced men in their sleep, draining their life through pleasure, and incubi male demons who violated sleeping women, leaving them swollen with evil seed. These stories were more than nightmares, they were explanations, tools to redirect guilt, To turn arousal into victimhood and the fear into doctrine? Priests wrote that wet dreams were not natural, but demonic assaults, and women who miscarried were accused of lying with devils, of opening their legs to shadows. Even monks weren't safe. Dreams of desire were said to come from temptation sent by Satan himself, and so they prayed harder, fasted longer, punished their own bodies with cold and whip and ash. But the dreams never stopped, because desire does not answer to dogma. It flickers in silence, it slips through cracks, it waits beneath robes and behind locked doors. And so they fought it like a war against nature, against themselves. And in war, there are always casualties. The young girl burned because she bled at the wrong time, the boy beaten because he looked too long, the midwife drowned because she delivered too many babies without a priest present, the poet imprisoned for writing a sonnet with too much longing in the second stanza. And all of it, every lash, every flame, every silence was justified by fear. Fear of X, fear of women, fear of men, fear of the self, and fear, above all, of pleasure. Because pleasure was ungovernable, unpredictable, it broke rank, it couldn't be counted or taxed or sanctified, and in a world obsessed with order, that made it enemy number one. And yet, buried beneath all of this was a different kind of history, one not written by bishops or barons, but carved into the beams of barns, whispered in kitchens, sewn into the hems of dresses, passed from mother to daughter. It was the knowledge that the body was not curse, but compass, not enemy, but instrument. That touch could heal as much as harm. And even when twisted, that yearning pointed towards something real, something still human, even under layers of rot and ritual. And that knowledge survived not in books, but in breath, passed on through generations, in lullabies, in warnings, in quiet choices. And today, when we look back and shudder, we do not only witness the darkness, we witness the resistance, the resilience of those who refused to be erased, those who knew that beneath every iron belt, every burned letter, every violent silence, there remained a pulse, a rhythm that could not be chained, and that rhythm still echoes now. In the stories we tell, in the truths we dare to name, in the strange comfort of knowing that even in the filthiest corners of history, someone, somewhere wanted more than shame, wanted softness, wanted to be held not as punishment, but as possibility. The courtrooms of the Middle Ages were not places of justice, but theaters of humiliatio. And nowhere was this clearer than in the trials of desire. Entire proceedings were built around the question of who touched whom, when, where, how, and most disturbingly why, but not out of concern for consent or harm. Those were modern concepts, alien to their understanding. No, the concern was for property, for honor, for order. A man who caught his wife with another could accuse her not just of adultery but of theft, because she had given away what he believed belonged to him, and he had the right to demand compensation, sometimes in money, sometimes in blood. But when the roles were reversed, when a woman accused a man, especially a man of status, she was often met not with sympathy, but suspicion. Her clothing was questioned, her past dissected, her very body put on trial. Did she bleed during the assault? Did she scream loudly enough? Did she try to bite? And if the answer to any of these was no, or worse, if she had previously been seen smiling in the accused's direction, the case was often dismissed or turned against her. She became the seductress, the liar, the whore. And if she persisted, she might be flogged for slander, imprisoned for perjury, or sent to the stocks where townspeople would spit, throw dung, sometimes worse. And yet, the most grotesque detail is this. Many of these trials weren't private. They were held in public squares in front of audiences, and the testimonies were read aloud, graphic, brutal, and unfiltered. The audience listened not in horror but fascination, because these were not just legal matters. They were entertainment, like bear baiting or public hangings, like puppet shows made of flesh and shame. And the church did not stand apart from the circus, it fueled it. Canon law was filled with edicts about X, not to protect the vulnerable, but to protect the power of the institution. A priest caught in fornication could often be reassigned quietly, especially if the other party was lower class, but a layperson caught defiling a priest by accusation alone might lose a tongue or be exiled, depending on the bishop's mood. And when priests broke their vows in private, they were told to fast, to pray, to perform penance. But when nuns were caught with each other, the punishments were far more severe: shaving, whipping, chaining in the cloister walls for weeks without light. Because female desire, especially unapproved desire, was seen as inherently more demonic. And so the walls of abbeys were not just silent, they were haunted. Not by ghosts, but by the groans of discipline, the scrape of chain against ankle, the weeping of girls who only wanted to be loved in a way the scriptures never allowed. And in the cities, another trial was taking place not in courtrooms but in the alleys, the brothels, the bathhouses. Cities were obsessed with regulating X, because regulating it meant taxing it, mapping it, exploiting it. London had entire districts set aside for prostitution, licensed, monitored, and patrolled, not to keep the women safe, but to keep them profitable. A prostitute who got pregnant could be fined, as could one who refused a paying customer. But if she was raped, no one cared, unless the attacker was poor, in which case he might be whipped to appease the peace. But a nobleman? He could pay a small fine and be done with it. In some regions, prostitutes were required to wear bells around their necks, to warn honest men of their presence. In others, they wore striped hoods or colored sashes, branding them not as criminals but as lower class. And if a brothel owner failed to report an outbreak of disease, he could be fined, but the women themselves? They were left to rot, to bleed, to go blind, to die unnamed. And the saddest part? Many of them began as children, sold by desperate parents, or kidnapped from orphanages, or rescued from sin, only to be forced back in when the convents had no room. And so they worked, bled, hid pregnancies, buried babies in riverbanks, and still were told they were the dirty ones. And if one of them ever dreamed of leaving, of finding love, of starting fresh, she was mocked. Not just by clients, but by the other women. Because hope was dangerous. It made you slow. It made you careless. It made you remember you were human. And in the X-economy of the Middle Ages, being human was a liability. Being numb was safer, being broken was efficient, and the men, they were not free either. Boys raised in brothels as servants often became addicted to violence. Some turned to crime. Others became pimps. The cycle continued, generation after generation, while outside, the townspeople walked past without looking, because looking meant admitting they knew, and knowing meant responsibility. And responsibility was the one sin the Middle Ages never forgave. Behind monastery walls, beneath the sound of chanting and the scent of incense, darker rituals unfolded. Things not written in psalms or sermons, but in hidden diaries, in court transcripts hastily burned, and in the whispers of novices who vanished before their second year, because the church may have claimed dominion over desire, but it never escaped it. Priests who preached against lust in public often sought it in confessionals, in orphanages, in the flickering shadows of candlelit choirs, and no one dared question them, because the hierarchy was protected like fortress walls. Only when scandal became too large to ignore, when a girl bled to death in the refectory, or a boy disappeared from his sickbed, did questions arise. But even then, the response was not justice, it was relocation, reassignment, silence dressed as mercy. Bishops moved predators like chess pieces, sending them from one parish to the next, always with a letter of glowing praise, and warnings delivered only in private, if at all. And the victims? They were told to pray harder, to confess their own sins, because surely they must have tempted the holy man. Surely their body, their gaze, their mere presence was the source of the corruption? And this wasn't fringe, it was structure, built into the spine of medieval belief, that the body was filthy, and desire more so, unless sanctioned by sacrament, and even then only for procreation, and even then only in darkness, under covers. Without joy, joy was suspect, joy was dangerous. And nowhere was this more evident than in noble courts, where X was less about desire and more about dominance. Nobles married for alliance, for land, for bloodlines, but they played in shadows, held masquerade feasts with masks and wine in hidden chambers, where servants were used like utensils, touched, tasted, discarded, and those who resisted were punished not with violence, but with humiliation. A maid who fought off a lord's advances might wake to find her family evicted from their cottage, her brother conscripted, her mother accused of theft, and so she learned, like others, to smile, to go still, to wait it out, to disassociate while the hands explored, while the lips lied, while the flesh forgot itself. And when rumors spread, when someone spoke up, the noble would laugh, who would believe her? And he was right. Because status protected filth, because power rewrote memory, and crimes committed by royalty became poems, romantic liaisons, scandalous affairs, while the victims became lines in margin notes or not mentioned at all. And what of the queens? The noble women? They too were trapped, traded like cattle, their lives dictated by lineage and legacy, forced to share beds with men they despised, to bear heirs as proof of piety. And if they failed, if the child was stillborn, if no pregnancy came within the year, they were blamed, their wombs questioned, their past lovers dug up in rumor, and if no cause was found, they were sent to convents, or worse, locked in towers, as if their failure were contagious. Some of them turned bitter, cruel, others turned inward, writing coded journals, sending messages through embroidery, painting images into tapestries that told stories no priest would ever understand, stories of resistance, of pain, of forbidden love, of longing they could never speak aloud. And those tapestries still hang today, in museums, above the heads of tourists who never pause long enough to read the thread, who never ask why a unicorn is pierced so many times, or why the maiden weeps in a field of lilies. And in those images lies the truth of the Middle Ages, not just the blood and mud and chains, but the trembling, desperate, suffocating hunger to be touched without being hurt, to be seen without being judged, to be desired without being devoured. And that hunger was not limited to castle walls. It writhed through villages, through markets, through fields, where peasants too followed customs of discipline and restraint. Girls who reached puberty were watched carefully, guided, observed for signs of distraction. Boys who blushed easily were reminded to focus on saints, to bathe in cold rivers, to recite prayers with stones in their shoes to help calm their minds. And if that didn't work, parents brought them to priests to have their troubles eased or cleansed. And sometimes that meant long hours of discipline, sometimes herbs that induced discomfort, sometimes removal from their homes, because personal matters were never private. They belonged to the community, to the church, to the state. And if you could not manage them yourself, others would manage for you, by force if necessary. And even when affection grew tender, sincere affection, it was feared, forbidden. A boy and girl who showed it openly might be punished publicly. A man who wrote a love song could be suspected of improper influence. And a woman who smiled often at the wrong man might be considered improper, because joy was seen as defiance, softness as challenge. And in that complex system, discipline became virtue, and virtue, above all, was the currency of survival. There were manuals written carefully, guides to marital duties passed from monk to noble, each one filled with detailed instructions on how and when a husband might approach his wife, never during menstruation, never on holy days, never during Advent, Lent, Pentecost, or any feast of saints, which left only a few appropriate days a year. And even then, the act had to be quiet, in darkness, face to face, with no unnecessary movement or sound. Anything else was considered improper, even if it brought new life, even if it brought relief. And yet, beneath this strict surface, secret practices grew quietly, hidden but persistent. There were private gatherings among nobles who reenacted sacred stories in ways that combined discipline with devotion, and there were monasteries where brothers took vows of purity but practiced rigorous self-discipline that sometimes led to emotional release. In hidden chambers beneath castles, certain rooms were used not just for correction, but for rituals known to few. The lines between discipline and ceremony were delicate. Devices once designed for order were adapted for other uses, and those involved were sometimes servants, performers, or choir members, brought in under the guise of tradition and becoming part of unusual entertainments. And if they resisted, they disappeared quietly, no questions asked, because in the Middle Ages, silence was survival, and obedience was often seen as holiness. Even in peasant homes, unique customs prevailed. A girl's virginity was not just valued. It was verified by midwives employed by the husband's family, who conducted careful inspections, noting signs of health and well-being, and if she met expectations, she was declared pure. If not, she might be returned or spoken of with suspicion, accused of improper influences. And while the church encouraged restraint, it also promoted family growth. Balancing contradictions: do not seek pleasure, but produce heirs. Do not indulge, but fulfill duty. And if that duty resulted in twins or stillbirths or deformities, it was seen as a sign, a trial of faith. Women prayed not just for children, but for forgiveness, even when they were innocent, even when they had little choice. And this uncertainty was used repeatedly to maintain control through fear, the fear that thoughts might betray you, that dreams might expose you, that feelings alone could endanger your soul. And into that fear, people turned to herbs, roots, whispered prayers, because the church forbade contraception, declaring it a grave sin. Yet women tried in secret, using pennyroyal teas, amulets, tied knots in hidden places, desperate to avoid hardship, childbirth dangers, and blame. And the midwives who helped them were often called witches, brought before councils, accused not of harm but of knowledge beyond accepted bounds, knowledge that challenged the established order, and for this they were punished, harshly stripped, shaved, searched for marks, sometimes in private places, then banished or worse, not because they harmed life, but because they understood it deeply, better than those who claimed authority over it. And the clergy responded by writing treatises describing the canon's navel, claimed that laughter during intimacy was a sign of negative influence, and all of this was accepted, studied, shared, taught in universities, woven into sermons, and believed by many, by too many, and the effects were visible everywhere, in art, law, in marks and stories. And yet, even here, even now, one must ask, how did love survive? Because it did, despite everything. There were stolen glances across village wells, letters hidden beneath firewood, hands held in secret while bells rang at dusk, songs written without names, lullabies sung to children born under difficult circumstances. And in those small, tender moments, humanity shone, flickered, endured. And that is perhaps the most profound truth: not cruelty, not shame, not hardship, but the persistence of kindness, the refusal of the heart to give up, the way something gentle managed to survive beneath chains, behind walls, under threat. And in that endurance we see something powerful, something sacred, a truth that the Middle Ages tried to erase but could not desire. Does not disappear, it adapts, it waits, it learns to live within rules, written in fear, and sometimes, in the quietest corners of history, it writes its own story, in a breath muffled by stone, in a hand that lingers a moment longer, in memories that no flame can consume. The streets of medieval cities carried not just the sense of daily life, but quiet longing, unspoken feelings. Moments of silence behind closed shutters and echoes where lullabies should have been heard. And within these narrow stone corridors moved people who had been taught to be cautious of their own bodies, to shy away from warmth, to regard desire as a path to trouble. They prayed not for pleasure but for self-control, control over thoughts, over dreams, over feelings and experiences. And yet, despite sermons and discipline, their yearning persisted. It found expression not as love but as ritual. As order cloaked in strictness in bathhouses where attendants cleaned carefully while sharing scriptures, in apothecaries that offered both holy water and herbal remedies, wrapped and labeled with care, and even in merchant homes where daughters were not taught about their bodies but instructed to keep them covered, to fear what grew beneath their gowns, to endure quietly and with patience. And when curiosity arose, it always did. It was met with stories of spirits and shadows, of beings who stole peace, of boys who were warned to avoid certain behaviors. And so intimacy became like a presence, unnamed, but always sensed nearby. This presence touched even the most devout monks who practiced discipline at the first sign of temptation, nuns who fasted until certain signs ceased, convinced that restraint was a path to purity. These acts were honored, regarded as holy endurance. Yet beneath this surface grew concern, focus, and tension, which expressed itself in many ways. Monasteries with enclosed gardens, where herbs were grown not only for healing, but for other purposes. Abbesses who limited singing because it heightened awareness. Confessors who asked for detailed accounts of dreams and thoughts, sometimes struggling themselves as they guided others. Outside, among common folk, conduct was monitored through social expectations. A woman bearing a child outside marriage might be publicly shamed, her appearance altered, sometimes required to wear symbols of humility, not for repentance alone, but as a social display. Shame became a public performance, the body a stage where honor was restored or lost. When the crowd jeered, when children threw stones, it was seen as correction, not cruelty. If she wept, she was scorned for weakness. If she held her head high, accused of pride. In either case, her future was limited: no marriage, no property, no peace, unless, of course, she chose a different path. And there was irony: the very men who condemned her might seek her company in secret, offering coin, cloaks, and promises. In those places, rules were strict. Clients demanded silence, obedience, even prayers during meetings, as if holiness could be controlled through ritual. The women adapted, learning to balance appearances, feigning purity and pleasure alike, and yet they were considered outcasts. Clergy who visited them claimed to offer guidance to the lost, the hypocrisy thick enough to overwhelm. And hypocrisy did not end there. The nobility created their own customs, their own exceptions, inventing elaborate ceremonies to excuse indulgence. Festivals marked by symbolic rituals, where social rules bent and twisted, with bread and fruit. And then with servants, fertility dances that ended with lords selecting girls based on how they moved, and those chosen were not allowed to refuse. They were blessed, elevated, and later discarded with no name, sometimes with child, and even the architecture mirrored the obsession. Church carvings featured figures gripping their genitals, animals in suggestive poses, demons licking thighs, all explained away as moral warning, yet positioned exactly at eye level, where monks passed daily, where children stared and laughed and asked questions no adult wanted to answer. And those same adults taught them shame before they taught them kindness, taught them silence before they taught them thought. And the cycle deepened, generation upon generation, learning that touch was sin, that softness was danger, that to want was to fall. And yet falling was everywhere, between pages of illuminated manuscripts where artists slipped erotic drawings into margins, between layers of sacred music where certain chants stretched notes long enough to make the body ache, in relics shaped suspiciously like phallic symbols, venerated by pilgrims who never asked why the wood was polished smooth. And in dreams, the last frontier of X-truth, where no priest could enter, no punishment could reach, and where peasants and princes alike found themselves writhing in visions they would never admit aloud. And when they awoke, they confessed, they wept, they begged for penance, but always they returned to the dream. Because in the dream there was no shame, only hunger, only the memory of what had been stolen from them, control over their own flesh, and the belief that desire could be beautiful. In the folds of the Middle Ages, behind locked doors and under heavy tapestries, there existed a world where X was not discussed but obsessively monitored, where temptation was seen not as a choice but as a disease, something that must be cauterized, exorcised, or concealed beneath layers of cloth and doctrine. And nowhere was this paradox more alive than in the marriage bed, a place supposedly sanctioned, holy, pure, yet the very design of that union was rooted in control. The husband as ruler, the wife as vessel, and pleasure, if acknowledged at all, belonged solely to the man. If a woman cried out in pain, it was considered normal, even expected, a sign that her body was resisting the sin of its own desire, and if she made any sound of joy, it was suspect, possibly demonic, possibly evidence of past impurity, and thus, silence became the only safe sound. And in noble houses, this silence was gilded, rooms decorated with icons and crucifixes, while acts of violence unfolded beneath them. Girls barely into womanhood presented to men twice their age, touched, examined, questioned like horses before a race. And the ritual of bedding became more than a formality, it was a public spectacle in many courts. The bedsheets displayed in the morning as proof of virgin blood, servants sometimes ordered to watch, to confirm consummation, to ensure the girl performed her duty. And what happened to those girls later, their bruises, their confusion, their trembling, was never written in the annals of dynasties. Only their wombs were recorded, how many heirs they bore, how many miscarriages they endured, how many nights they bled out in silence, while the court toasted alliances made in flesh and ink, and those not of noble birth fared no better. In villages, the local lord had droit du seigneur, the supposed right to bed any peasant bride on her wedding night, a practice debated by historians, but feared by peasants regardless, because fear is powerful even when the law is vague. And whether the right was real or not, the threat was, and that was enough to bend backs and close mouths, and the clergy, who were meant to offer protection, too often did the opposite. Confessors who asked too many questions about dreams, priests who offered absolution in exchange for flesh, bishops who kept secret ledgers of their favorite penitents. And if a girl refused, she might find herself accused of witchcraft, her hair shaved, her body examined carefully, her character judged, and the same men who called her improper would now accuse her as proof of their own righteousness. And the cycle sustained itself, fear encouraging silence, silence enabling hardship, and hardship becoming tradition. These traditions grew stranger with each generation, with rituals developing to manage feelings, boys sent to monasteries at early signs of change, girls secluded during their first menstruation, kept near statues while their families prayed, believing it was for their protection, but it often felt like punishment, like being confined in cloth and prayer. In marketplaces, charms for fertility were sold alongside rosaries, small carved tokens blessed by traveling monks who claimed they brought protection, and the same markets offered devices both symbolic and real, intended not only for safeguarding, but also for control and humiliation. Because the true purpose of such control was not purity, but ownership, the woman's body as property, a man's desire as law. Yet desire resisted control and sometimes erupted in disturbing ways. In tavern games where men gambled on cruel acts to animals, in public punishments of women accused of wrongdoing, crowds jeering, children watching and learning, until such harshness became normal, depicted in woodcuts, jokes, and songs, a culture mocking what it claimed to protect. Within that contradiction lay the spirit of the age, not holy or noble, but desperate, confused, pained, and harsh. Still, amid the harshness, sparks of resistance appeared: midwives passing secret knowledge quietly to girls, scribes hiding love poems among religious texts, lovers fleeing, choosing exile over obedience, facing wildness and winter rather than returning to cold beds. Those stories seldom ended well, but their very existence was rebellion, a reminder that even in the most restrained, most controlled era, people sought more, not more desire, but more truth, gentleness, freedom, and their longing echoes beneath every record, every reprimand, every sermon, silent but remembered. Medieval intimacy had a scent no one wrote down, but all remembered, lingering in wooden cottages and noble chambers alike, a mixture of sweat, fear, herbs, and blood, sometimes masked with rosewater or incense, but always present, reminding of the era's contradictions, reverence and discomfort, purity and temptation, command and chaos. The more the church called for restraint, the more it studied desire's workings. Monks cataloged behaviors, creating detailed lists of what led to moral failure: hand motions, positions, thoughts, and these lists ironically taught more about intimacy than forbade it. In manuscript margins, scribes sketched hidden images, figures, faces, creatures, suggesting that even recording such matters stirred the imagination. Outside monasteries, peasants held fertility festivals, girls jumping over fires to show readiness, boys wearing horns and ash markings, and under moonlight, social rules softened. Elders pretended not to see what happened behind barns, remembering their youth full of questions and desires. Yet mourning brought guilt sharpened by sermons and discipline. So repentance became cyclical, not just confession, but hardship. Young men disciplined themselves before statues. Mothers scolded daughters finding herbs. Fathers sent sons to monasteries for cleansing. Meanwhile, real injustices, those of power and coercion, went unchecked. Lords with servants kept in harems, priests who silenced altar boys with threats, midwives arrested not for harm, but for mercy, knowing how to aid women with herbs and teas. When caught, these women were paraded, publicly restrained, shamed, their tools destroyed, their names erased. The message was clear: knowledge was forbidden, and sin was to be purged by fire. But fire could not destroy memory, which spread like quiet mold, like whispers in bathhouses, songs sung by washerwomen filled with warnings and secrets. These secrets passed through generations. Even as cities rose and fell, plagues came and went, cathedrals crumbled and rebuilt. Because the body remembers, blood remembers, and even those silent about it, especially those carried this knowledge deep within. And so, the horror lived on. In the absence of joy, in the ritual of silence, in the marriage beds that felt like cages, and in the eyes of children who learned too early that their bodies were not their own, that every sensation had a price, that every mistake had a punishment. And the worst part was not the brutality, it was the normalization of it. The fact that entire villages could watch a woman be stoned for adultery and then eat dinner, could listen to a boy scream in a confessional and then light candles for the Virgin, could see blood on the sheets and call it honor. And as generations passed, the language softened, but the violence endured, rebranded as discipline, as tradition, as divine will. And those who suffered were told they had chosen it, that obedience was love, that pain was redemption, and the ones who resisted, those rare, brave ones, they were written out, their names lost, their stories smothered. But sometimes, in the ruins of chapels, under crumbling frescoes, you can still find etchings, initials carved into stone, a heart, a date, a plea for mercy or memory, proof that someone once loved against the rules, touched without permission, or simply wanted to feel alive before they died. And that is the true legacy of X in the Middle Ages, not just filth and fear, but the quiet, stubborn refusal to be erased, to be silenced, to be turned into a sermon or a warning. The ghost of desire humming beneath everything, waiting, watching, surviving. The further you dig into the Middle Ages, the more the concept of X reveals itself not as a part of life, but as a battlefield. A cursed frontier where pleasure was equated with possession and desire with domination, and no place showed this better than the institutions that were meant to care, to heal, to guide monasteries, infirmaries, guilds of midwives, places that on the surface stood for virtue but behind their thick stone walls witnessed some of the darkest ex-abuses in recorded time. And it began with the body, always the body, seen not as sacred but as suspicious, as a vessel easily possessed by lust, demons, or women's wicked humors. And so the body was surveilled, locked up, bled, gagged, chained, fed broth laced with crushed stones to dampen the appetite, or dunked in cold water to cleanse unruly heat, and such treatments were not reserved for the ill or insane. They were administered to girls who simply bled early, to boys who asked too many questions, to women who dared suggest that X might be about more than duty or shame. And this brutal suppression birthed an entire industry of horror where the concept of healing was twisted into punishment, and those in power called it mercy, and so came the X-cures, the bizarre tools and rituals meant to purge desire, like powdered bones of virgins taken as tonics, or scalding irons placed beneath beds to scare away impure dreams. And for women, especially those labeled hysterical or cursed with insatiable wombs, treatments grew even more obscene: vaginal fumigations using sulfur smoke, forced penetration with religious relics to bless the sinful path, and in the worst cases, surgical interventions done with rusty knives, without consent, without anesthesia, all in the name of God and control. And if the woman screamed, she was told it was her demon leaving. If she passed out, she was said to have found peace, and if she died, the priests claimed she was now in heaven, her temptation conquered at last. And still, the cycle continued, because medieval culture did not just fear female X, it feared female autonomy. The very idea that a woman might understand her own body, make her own choices, feel her own hunger and not apologize for it. And so education was denied, literacy withheld, even menstruation left unexplained, cloaked in shame and superstition. Girls thinking they were dying the first time they bled, mothers passing down fear instead of knowledge, and into that ignorance crept horror, tales of blood attracting demons, of witches using their periods to poison wells, and because no one corrected these lies, they spread. And because they spread, the punishments grew crueler, and even midwives, the rare women who did know the body, who passed knowledge from hand to hand like sacred fire, were hunted, accused, tortured, burned, because they knew too much. Because they gave women tools the church refused: herbs for pleasure, herbs for pain, herbs for ending a pregnancy or beginning one. And that power terrified men, especially those in robes and hats and pulpits. Men who claimed to speak for God yet flinched at the mention of wombs, and so they fought that power with everything they had: with doctrine, with fire, with law, with silence. And the silence was worst of all, because it made every girl feel alone, made every bruise feel like her fault, made every whisper of desire sound like blasphemy. And so she buried it, deep inside, where it festered, and centuries later, that rot still lingers, in the shame that outlived the fire, in the myths that never fully died, in the quiet way X is still discussed today, as something to hide, to fear, to regulate. And the irony is unbearable that in a time so obsessed with X, the people lived lives almost entirely devoid of love, of touch, of tenderness, not soaked in violence or contract. And that truth haunts the Middle Ages more than any ghost, that for all their cathedrals and crusades and codes of honor, they failed in the simplest thing: to let people be human, to let them touch without terror, to feel without punishment, to want without war. In the heart of medieval Europe, buried beneath the chants and censors, deeper than any dungeon or relic chamber, lay the unspoken truth that X was never just about bodies. It was about control, about who was allowed to feel, to touch, to want, and who was condemned for even imagining it. And this control wasn't only enforced through fire and blade, but through spectacle, humiliation, and public ritual, because shame is a powerful leash, and the Middle Ages knew how to use it. And so came the punishments, absurd and theatrical. Bodies paraded through town squares with signs around their necks: lewd woman, impure boy, fornicator. Temptation's vessel forced to crawl naked through streets, to kneel in front of statues, to wear iron masks shaped like animals. Each distortion of flesh meant to mimic their supposed inner corruption, and the crowd did not look away. They watched, they cheered, they memorized, because watching others suffer made them feel safer, holier, and in some twisted way, entertained. And so shame became a kind of theater, a traveling show repeated in every town, every province, every kingdom. And the performers were always the same women who dared to love, men who didn't desire properly, children caught touching themselves, and dragged to confession, made to confess not just their sin but the color, the frequency, the sensation, until they sobbed and begged to be purified. And the priests, the judges, the scribes, those who listened did not flinch, because this was not about mercy, it was about order, about keeping the world clean and predictable. And anything that deviated, anything unpredictable, had to be named, broken, rebuilt. And even language was twisted to serve this end, with words like impurity, sin, lust, temptation used like clubs, each syllable a blow meant to reduce a person to nothing but mistake and shame. And so came the manuals, hundreds of pages written by monks who had never touched a woman, instructing husbands on how to discipline wives who expressed desire, how to spot signs of infidelity, how to interrogate a midwife, how to destroy herbs that might induce miscarriage. And all of it was called holy, sacred, God's work, even as it left trails of blood and silence through every village it touched. And the silence was generational, passed down like a curse, like a song no one liked, but everyone knew. Mothers teaching daughters not how to live, but how to survive, how to avoid the wrong glance, how to lie still and not cry, how to swallow the pain and clean the sheets and smile. And the fathers taught sons to fear softness, to strike before they were struck, to marry young and control faster. And in the rare cracks where rebellion bloomed in hidden journals, in forest gatherings, in the bedchambers of those too tired to keep pretending it was fragile, fleeting, quickly snuffed out or absorbed back into myth. And yet it mattered, because even the act of whispering desire, of naming the forbidden, of imagining something better, was an act of resistance. And in this way, the Middle Ages were not just disgusting in their treatment of X, they were terrified of it, obsessed, possessed, and that terror bled into everything, from architecture with its carved warnings, to songs that demonized women, to fairy tales, where any girl who disobeyed met a gruesome end. And so the world was built not on love, not on trust, but on fear. And fear breeds monsters. And the biggest monsters wore robes, wrote scrolls, passed judgment, and slept soundly, convinced they had saved the world from itself. And all the while, the real world of sweat and sighs and softness and sadness went unseen, unspoken, unheld. By the time the 14th century rolled across the tortured map of Europe, the damage had calcified into doctrine. The shame had become structure, and the twisted perception of X had so deeply infected every layer of life that even the most basic human gesture, a kiss, a sigh, a touch, had to be examined, interrogated, and, if necessary, punished. And nowhere was this more grotesquely visible than in the system of public repentance that emerged as both theater and warning, where the accused, sometimes barely older than children, were made to stand before entire congregations and recount their supposed ex-sins in excruciating detail, naming acts they barely understood, trembling as men in robes nodded gravely, as neighbors whispered softly, as family quietly distanced themselves, and this was called purification, though in reality it became a public ritual, a slow unraveling of self, where innocence was not simply lost but openly challenged before all. This performance stirred something deep and unspoken in the crowd, a need not only to judge, but to feel cleansed by contrast. And so the cycle continued, fueled by fear and misunderstanding. Those who dared question it, women supporting others, men who stood by their truth, healers who spoke with knowledge rather than fear, were not only punished but erased from records, accused in harsh terms, removed or hidden, their names forgotten, their families left vulnerable. Behind this veil of severity lay a profound truth. The fear around intimacy in the Middle Ages was less about moral judgment and more about maintaining control, about making the world smaller and more predictable, about denying uncertainty. To admit that intimacy might be natural, varied, and unpredictable was to admit that control was fragile. Therefore, strict rules were established, often harsh and complex, such as forbidding closeness on certain days, during holy seasons or special observances, leaving only limited times when married couples could be together without fear. Even then, it was about duty, continuity, and loyalty. Pleasure, if present, was regarded as unintended or improper. Generations were taught to distinguish body from spirit, viewing desire as something to be managed or suppressed. This concept took many forms, seen as a challenge, as danger, or as something to be hidden, and individuals who showed divergence were watched, judged, and excluded. Thus, the Middle Ages fostered a culture of caution, suspicion, and silence, where people often confessed to things they did not do to avoid harsher outcomes. Tools and symbols of control appeared, not just myths, but real instruments representing attempts to govern minds as much as bodies. Beneath all ceremony and discipline lay a quiet fear that order was fragile, that love and connection could not be fully regulated, and that people would find ways to connect despite rules. Because this truth could not be extinguished, it was buried beneath layers of silence, shame, and hardship, but never fully erased. Fragments remain graffiti on walls, hidden letters, carved symbols, prayers left unnamed telling of secret connections, whispered affection, lives that dared to love and lost much, but kept memory alive. Memory, resilient and gentle, refuses to fade. It lives within us in the emotions stirred by these tales, in the urge to understand that even then, despite hardships, people sought more, hoped for more, believed in more than fear. This enduring hope, though often silenced, remains one of the most profound legacies of that time. By the early 15th century, the world had been reshaped by plagues, wars, famine, and widespread fear. Yet perhaps no force affected the spirit of ordinary people more deeply than the ongoing tension around the body and its desires. This tension was most subtly present in the practices surrounding intimacy and restraint. Over time, rituals born of fear became normalized. Communities themselves upheld silence, passing it down through lullabies, prayers, meaningful glances, gentle warnings, and quiet reminders never to speak openly of bodily feelings, not even in dreams. And this normalization of shame was so complete, so total, that entire villages lived as if desire were an infection that floated on the wind, waiting to enter through uncovered hair, a glance held too long, a whisper in a shadowed stable, and to protect against it, they layered themselves not just in wool and linen, but in scripture, superstition, routine, and fear. They bound their women's breasts from adolescence to prevent the rise of lust. They trained their boys to look at the ground when addressing females. They told stories of demons that entered the soul through dreams, and to guard against that, they invented night prayers, to bind the legs, to keep the arms across the chest, to shame any movement beneath the blanket as possession, not instinct. And this daily performance of purity required constant reinforcement, so the church supplied it with sermons that graphically described the fate of the lustful, eternal fire boiling, skin rivers of acid flowing through genitals, devils shaped like women whispering temptations into ears, until the soul cracked and these images were painted, carved, etched into stone, placed over doorways and on prayer books, so that even a child could see what would happen if they disobeyed. And in this atmosphere of terror, there were institutions built to contain the broken. Those who could not follow the rules, those who whispered too loud, or wandered alone, or worse still admitted, they did not feel guilt, and these places called hospitals, but functioning more like spiritual prisons were filled with women accused of wantonness, boys accused of soft masculinity, girls who bled too early, and widows who refused to remarry, and the treatments were worse than the dungeon's leeches applied to genitals. Freezing baths held for hours without movement, forced fasts that bordered on starvation, sleep deprivation, chanting that lasted days, exorcisms performed by sweating, trembling priests who whispered scripture into the ears of children and told them that this pain was holy, that this silence was salvation. And some broke entirely, became husks, empty faces at windows, fingers counting days without knowing why others escaped. Not through flight, but through ritual compliance, learning to fake guilt, to whisper apologies, to recite the same lies. So often they began to believe them because to survive meant to forget the self, and to forget the self meant to become useful, clean, invisible. And the irony twisted deeper still, because while the people were shamed, punished, even killed for desire, the very institutions that punished them were rife with the same impulses cloaked in power, the same bishops who condemned X outside of marriage, kept concubines in secret rooms, the same judges who sentenced young men to death for sodomy met their own lovers in hidden alleys, the same priests who swore virginity, laid trembling hands upon orphans, and called it divine mystery, and the people knew they knew. But the fear was too strong, the system too vast, the shame too internalized, and so they looked away because to see meant to risk. And no one could afford to risk when even a dream could be used against you. And this fear seeped into everything, into the architecture with its narrow windows and locked doors, into the clothing designed to hide every curve, every shadow of skin, into the songs sung at night, which warned of witches and lustful ghosts and wolves that licked your feet in your sleep, and into the punishments which became more creative as time passed, binding chairs with spikes for those who touched themselves, needles driven under nails for the disobedient tongues split with razors, for those who dared to speak of pleasure, and all of it framed not as cruelty, but as cleansing, because the filth was not on the skin, it was in the soul, and the only way to purify was to hurt and be hurt. And through it all, people still fell in love, people still touched under haylofts, still whispered to each other beneath trees, still left small carved hearts on stable beams, and burned letters in the hearth when footsteps neared, because desire cannot be killed. It only hides and waits. And even in the most disgusting, darkest, twisted hours of the medieval world, that spark remained terrified, buried and trembling, but still alight. And that is what makes it worse. The knowledge that so much violence was committed not against monsters but against that spark, and it still shames us today because the past is not past when the silence remains. And in many ways, we still carry their guilt, their fear, their suppression like inherited chains. We never asked for, but still wear. And only by seeing it, speaking it, remembering it, do we begin to melt the links. There is a moment in every age where fear becomes doctrine, and doctrine becomes law. And in the Middle Ages, that moment came not with a scream, but with a silence, a wide, heavy, punishing silence that draped itself across cities, villages, and cathedrals alike. And in that silence, the disgust for X wasn't just written into parchment, it was carved into architecture, into the rhythms of daily life, into the ways people walked, breathed, sat, or slept. You could feel it in the way doors were constructed thick and narrow, made to close tightly, to block out the world, but more importantly, to trap what was inside. You could hear it in the bells that rang not just for mass, but for penance bells that tolled when a girl was caught with a boy behind a stable, or when a midwife was accused of offering comfort. that had no church approval. Those bells, they didn't chime, they accused. And slowly, people began to ring them in their own minds, punishing themselves long before anyone else had the chance. Because in this world, the body itself was dangerous. And X? X was the devil's mirror, reflecting not just temptation, but rebellion. A woman who enjoyed her body was a witch. A man who sought pleasure outside of his duty to procreate was a heretic. A child who asked questions about their body was considered infected not by disease, but by sin. And what does a culture do to infection? It isolates it, cuts it out, destroys it. So monasteries were filled not just with the pious, but with the broken people who sought isolation as protection, who believed that by separating themselves from the world, they might finally be clean. But there, behind stone walls and endless prayers, the mind did not go quiet, it grew louder. And that is the great cruelty of the time, that even in their deepest attempts to be pure, the people were haunted not by demons, but by thoughts, by longings they could not name, by urges they'd been taught to loathe, by shame that didn't fade with fasting or flogging. And so the rituals grew more violent, iron belts locked around waists, iron thorns pressed against thighs, hot stones placed on chests to burn out the lust. Every step was watched, every glance was measured. Women were told to sleep with their backs against their husbands, lest they incite lust. Men were warned to speak to their wives only in the dark, through a cloth screen, to preserve holiness. Entire towns would gather when someone was accused of impropriety, not to help, but to judge, to watch, to remind themselves that it could happen to them. And so fear became entertainment. Executions of deviants were scheduled like festivals. The accused were stripped, mocked, paraded through streets, and the crowd, children included, watched and cheered, not out of cruelty, but out of relief. It's not me. That was the motto, even if never spoken aloud. But even then, even in that carnival of shame, the truth lingered. People touched, people kissed in barns, in cellars, in forests. Lovers carved initials into tree bark. Women passed herbal mixtures in secret. Men shared glances that lasted too long. And this is what enraged the church the most, not the sin itself, but the fact that it couldn't be fully controlled. The body, no matter how much it was beaten, bound, or burned, still remembered softness, still ached, still betrayed the rules. And so the punishments intensified. Torture chambers beneath monasteries were filled not with criminals, but with those who confessed too little or too late. Devices were invented that shamed as they scarred, like the scold's bridle, a metal cage for the head with spikes for the tongue, or the chastity wheel, which crushed the hips of women who provoked desire. Each tool was given a name, a purpose, and a prayer. And with every scream they believed, the world became cleaner, holier. But it didn't. It just became quieter, more hollow. And over time, that silence became its own kind of violence, one that echoed through generations. Mothers taught daughters to cover their hair, their legs, their voices. Fathers warned sons to be hard, to never weep, to strike before they were touched. And slowly, a world was built not on connection, but on avoidance, on self-denial, on fear. Yet even then, in hidden corners, resistance pulsed. In poems, in songs sung under breath, in lovers' letters buried beneath floorboards, in the desperate beauty of two hands meeting in a stable at midnight. That, too, was the Middle Ages, not just the horror, but the persistence of desire, the refusal to be erased. And it is in that refusal, fragile, flickering, that something human survived. Somewhere between the church bell and the whip, between the sermon and the cell, the medieval world perfected a weapon more subtle than any blade guilt. Not the kind of guilt that comes from doing harm, but the quiet, inescapable guilt of simply being alive in a body that hungered, that ached, that dreamed in color even when the waking world was made of ash and fear. And this guilt was no accident. It was designed, layer by layer, like the bricks in a monastery wall. It was baked into every story told to children, where X was a curse whispered by witches, where women who wanted were drowned or burned, and men who felt tenderness for their own were gutted in public squares. These were not fairy tales, they were instruction manuals. And by the time a child could speak, they had already learned to fear their body, to flinch at their own reflection, to confess things they hadn't done simply to feel clean. And the church was clever. It offered forgiveness for a price, indulgences sold like bread at market, confessionals built like traps, dark, enclosed, and eternal. You could enter with a sin that lived only in your imagination and leave with a punishment that scarred your soul. Priests listened not with compassion, but with appetite. Some took notes, others took more. And through it all, the people kept coming because the church had cornered the market on salvation, and if you didn't buy in, you were damned. Entire towns lived this way, where a glance could cost you your freedom, a rumor could end your marriage, and a dream could mean execution. There were no safe places. Not in the home, where fathers were taught to rule like kings and wives were property. Not in the tavern, where jesters whispered filth but always looked over their shoulders. And not in the fields, where the wind carried secrets and the crows remembered. And yet, somehow, against all reason, all threat, all pain, people still craved. They craved softness. They craved warmth. They craved the X that had been denied to them, not because it was wrong, but because it was powerful. Because it was the one thing they could not fully kill. And so it survived in gestures so small they almost didn't exist. A hand brushing another in the dark, a song that carried a hidden meaning, a smile shared in silence. These were acts of rebellion, of survival, of unbearable beauty, and they were punished all the same. But not all punishments were fire and chains. Some were colder, quieter. Entire convents were turned into prisons, where women were locked for life, not for crimes, but for bleeding at the wrong time, for speaking out, for refusing a man. These places stank of mold, of rot, of weeping. And still, the sisters sang. They sang songs that told stories no scripture would ever hold. And when one disappeared, taken in the night by guards or worse, they would mark her absence in silence, in candlelight, in prayers said backward. In this way, resistance became liturgy. In monasteries, monks who felt the stirrings they had vowed to bury would throw themselves into thorns, into freezing rivers, into days of silence. But the thoughts returned, the body remembered, and so guilt became obsession. They wrote treatises, long, fevered, terrified arguments about how to destroy desire. They cataloged every sin in Latin. They prayed with bleeding hands. They starved. They saw demons in every dream, and yet still, somewhere beneath it all, they longed. They longed for touch, for understanding, for a world where being human was not a curse. And perhaps the most disgusting part of all the real filth was that those in power knew this. They knew the fear they were creating. They knew the desire they were condemning was human, and they used it anyway, because a population that is ashamed is easy to rule. A people taught to hate themselves will never rise. And so X became the chain, the cage, the cell, not the act itself, but the silence around it, the fear of speaking, the fear of knowing, the fear of wanting. And that silence, that engineered, centuries-old silence, is what we must still undo. Because its echoes remain, in laws that shame, in cultures that punish, in whispers that warn, in stories we tell our children about purity and dirt. But there is another story too older, deeper, buried but alive. The story of bodies that knew each other without permission, of hands that reached through bars, of love that bloomed in dungeons. That story, too, is ours. And tonight, you carry it. You remember it. You let it live again. Because even in the dirtiest, most disgusting, most condemned corners of medieval X history, there was always one thing they could never burn: hope. It began with silence. But by the 6th century of doctrine, the silence had shape, the silence had color, the silence had teeth. And those teeth were buried in every law, every prayer, every breath taken beneath cathedral domes or thatched roofs alike. Because now, the system was not just a structure, it was the air, the ground, the water, and the filth of the body had become not just an inconvenience, but a moral plague. And those who carried it, women who bled, men who dreamed, children who asked, were seen not as misguided, but as threats to the soul of the world itself. So the church, swollen with power and trembling with its own repressed tremors, doubled down, and what followed was not enlightenment, but escalation. Escalation of rules, of rituals, of punishments so ornate they bordered on the theatrical. And yet their purpose was always the same: control, not of land, not of politics, but of flesh. And the theater began in confessionals now built like cages, like tiny tombs for the soul, darkened booths where a trembling voice had to speak of what it barely understood to a man who listened not with love but with authority. And the questions were not kind. Did you touch? Did you look? Did you dream? And the answers were always wrong, because to dream at all was now a crime. And so the penance grew, more lashings, more days without bread, more kneelings on stone floors until the knees bled into the cracks. And behind those walls, in monasteries turned fortresses, the war on the body was turned inward. Monks wrote entire volumes cataloging sins of the flesh, not in order to understand, but to destroy, and they wrote with urgency, with panic, with ink that shook from hands that had once known softness, and each page was a scream disguised as scripture. And in convents, where women were supposed to find peace, there was none, because the church had decreed that even their dreams were suspect. So they were woken each hour of the night to pray, to chant, to prove that they were not succumbing to the devil's touch in sleep. And if a sister was caught moaning in the dark, she was dragged from her bed, her bedding burned, her name struck from the record, her eyes hollowed by days without speech. And yet still, somehow, the longing persisted. Because longing is not sin. Longing is proof that something human still breathes beneath the ash. And so the walls thickened, the rules tightened, and with each new edict came a new horror in some towns. Girls who reached puberty too young were locked in basements until their bodies stopped developing, and boys who refused to speak of dreams were forced to sleep beside open graves as a reminder of their supposed rot, and herbalists were banned from making salves that brought relief to aching women because pleasure itself had become evidence of guilt. And if a husband accused his wife of being too responsive, too warm, too willing, it was not he who was questioned, but she was. She, a demon, a succubus, a temptress, sent to test his faith. And so trials were held not just for witches, but for wives, for widows, for mothers who had birthed too many children and dared to survive. And even the instruments of healing were turned into tools of torture tongs, used to probe under the guise of inspection, rods inserted to measure purity, branding irons kissed with the names of saints used to mark those who had fallen. And the crowd did not cry, they watched, they whispered, because they had been taught that to feel pity was to risk infection. And so they hardened, and the hardening became tradition, and tradition became law, and law bled into faith, and faith twisted, malformed, became something monstrous, something that wore robes and rings and recited Latin while wielding pain as penance. And the true horror was this, that they believed it. They believed they were saving the world, that every girl burned, every boy whipped, every lover separated by fire and shame was a victory against evil. But the evil was never in the act, it was in the silence that followed, in the empty pews where parents wept and pretended not to, in the candles lit not for hope, but for forgetting, in the hymns sung louder to drown the cries behind cloister walls. And beneath all of it, the truth festered, unspoken but alive, that the church had not cleansed the world of exit, had merely buried it deeper and deeper until it seeped into the roots of every law, every custom, every breath taken by those too afraid to name the thing they longed for most: freedom. The silence that once hovered over the medieval world like fog had by the 13th century turned into something else entirely. It had become machinery, a set of mechanisms that worked not only to suppress, but to surveil, to measure, to brand, and to break. And that machinery was powered not just by priests and kings, but by neighbors, families, even lovers, because the system had become self-sustaining, a loop of fear that no longer needed chains or whips to function, though they were used still, of course. Polished and blessed, but rather operated through shame, through suspicion, through the gnawing belief that your thoughts could betray you, that a stray glance might condemn you, that a moment of warmth might be a trap laid by Satan himself. And nowhere was this more evident than in the laws passed during what they called the Century of Correction, a series of decrees that aimed not merely to guide the population, but to disassemble the human instinct altogether. And those decrees reached into homes, into bedrooms, into the dark folds of intimacy, not to illuminate but to infect. And so new roles were created: watchmen of morality, men assigned to listen at windows, to catalog who entered whose door at night, and what sounds were heard within. And even in monasteries, elder monks were told to record the sleeping positions of their brothers, to ensure no limb brushed another, no sigh lingered too long. And this paranoia filtered downward into every village and farmstead, where women were fined for walking too confidently, where girls were locked away if their hips widened too quickly, where men were flogged for having dreams they could not describe, and boys were beaten for refusing to look priests in the eye, because the eye, they believed, was the window to sin. And in that madness, the body itself became a battleground, its every curve, every pulse, every whisper of heat treated as evidence in an invisible trial. And those who dared to speak out, those who questioned, who remembered a time before, or who simply could not survive in such suffocating darkness, they were erased, not with fire or steel, but with silence, their names scratched from ledgers, their families shunned, their graves unmarked, and yet their presence lingered in the spaces they once occupied, in the pauses between verses, in the hesitations of prayers. And it was then that the architecture itself began to change. Churches constructed with longer shadows, with darker corners, with sanctuaries designed not for refuge, but for fear. And in those spaces, the sermons changed too, shifting from tales of salvation to threats of torment, graphic, lurid descriptions of eternal punishment that almost mirrored the acts they claimed to condemn. And from pulpits, men described with theatrical horror the very things they fantasized about in secret bodily acts, desires, warmth, and with every word, they planted images, burned them into the minds of children too young to understand and elders too afraid to question. And thus, the church became the very author of the sin it hunted, creating monsters and then punishing those who dreamed of them. And in the name of purity, midwives were forbidden to offer comfort during childbirth, told instead to chant psalms as women screamed, because pain, they believed, was cleansing. And in the name of piety, husbands were encouraged to police their wives, to strike them if they suspected desire. And in the name of holiness, entire villages were razed when accused of secret festivals where the body was honored rather than hidden. And the ashes of those towns still whisper in the soil of Europe today. And in this world, to touch was treason. To love was war, to feel was death, and yet, even then, there were moments, tiny, trembling sparks of humanity that refused to go out. A girl who left a carved heart beneath the altar, a boy who traced poetry into the dust on a chapel wall, a woman who braided her dead sister's hair with wildflowers, because beauty, even forbidden, was still a form of truth. And those truths, though beaten, shamed, and buried, survived in the spaces between rules, in the margins of ledgers, in the corners of paintings where hands almost touch, in the notes of songs hummed under breath in fields too far from town to hear the bells. And those songs did not praise kings or saints. They praised the body, the touch, the moment, the forbidden ache that made life feel like life. And that ache, it was not sin, it was memory. Memory of what it meant to be whole. And it is that memory we carry now, that echo we must follow, back through the dark, past the chains and the lies and the fire, to the truth they tried so hard to silence, that X is not evil, it is human, and to erase it is to erase ourselves. By the time the 14th century limped into view, dragging behind it plague and famine and blood-soaked parchment, the war on the body had evolved into a kind of theater, a grotesque performance where every villager was both actor and audience, both suspect and spy, and the stage was no longer just the pulpit, or the courtroom, or the whipping post, but the mind itself, which had been reshaped, rewired, beaten into believing that desire was death, and the most disgusting part of all was not the acts themselves, the hunger, the touch, the whispered dreams, it was the reaction to them, the coordinated, systemic, ritualized cruelty that followed even the smallest step outside the lines drawn in centuries-old ink, because now, the church had invented new tools, new punishments that did not rely on flames, but on shame, on ritual exposure, on linguistic violence, so refined, it could make a grown man confess to sins he had never imagined just to be allowed be, back inside the gate. And so came the penitential processions, long lines of naked figures painted with ashes, bells tied to their ankles, crawling through mud while priests sang psalms, and villagers threw spoiled fruit, and children were taught to laugh, and every stone in those cobbled streets remembered the pain of knees that had bled not from crime, but from hunger for touch, for kindness, for X, and in this world, art was forbidden unless it served doctrine, and the body could be painted only in scenes of punishment or martyrdom, and so even beauty became a trap, and those who carved secretly, those who painted desire into margins, who wrote love into the spaces between verses, did so, knowing that discovery meant ruin, and yet they did it anyway, because the urge to remember what the church wanted forgotten was too strong. And in these hidden works we find glimpses of truth, a stone carving beneath a pew where two hands meet in silence, a psalter with a face in the vines that looks too much like a real boy to be chance, a stained glass figure whose expression holds more warmth than warning. And this was the rebellion, not with swords, not with fire, but with memory, with persistence, with the quiet refusal to forget what it meant to feel. And that feeling was not always soft, not always romantic sometimes. It was grotesque, raw, desperate, because repression creates not purity but distortion. And the Middle Ages birthed horrors not only in its dungeons, but in its bedrooms, in its minds, in its doctrine. Because when you teach generations that their bodies are filthy, they begin to treat them as such. And so emerged the secret societies of pain groups who met in basements and ruins, not to worship, but to punish themselves. Not for redemption, but because they had been told so long that suffering was holy, they began to crave it. And the X they practiced was not tender, but warped, because it had been stolen from them, twisted by rules written by men who themselves could not live by them, and worse, who did not even try. And in these places we find the echoes of cruelty mistaken for piety, men who whipped themselves bloody in front of altars, believing each drop was a step closer to heaven, and women who wore belts of thorns, not because they feared temptation, but because they had been taught their bodies could cause earthquakes. And in towns where the harvest failed, the blame was not drought or soil, but desire someone must have touched someone. Someone must have whispered something at night, and so a woman would be dragged to the square, accused of X, in the same breath as witchcraft, and the trial would not be fair, would not be quiet, would not be based in any kind of truth. It would be theater, again, a public purge where the crowd could relieve their own guilt by watching someone else suffer, and these spectacles were common, so common they became festivals, and children grew up with them as holidays, and the lines between religion and revenge, between law and lust, between control and collapse, blurred until they vanished, and through it all, the true X, the X of softness, of mutual warmth, of joy was nowhere to be found, buried beneath centuries of fear and punishment and distorted power. And yet, even now, we find traces, fossilized in the margins of forbidden books, etched into the corners of architecture, whispered in lullabies that somehow survived. And those traces matter, because they tell us what was lost, what was taken, what was burned, and they tell us, too, that it was not the people who were disgusting, not the feelings, not the desires, but the system that convinced them they were. And that system was not holy, not sacred. It was scared. Scared of the power that comes from knowing your own body, from loving without permission, from dreaming in color. And so tonight, as we remember these medieval nightmares, we do not flinch from the filth. We name it, we trace it, we hold it to the light, and we say, this is not us, this is not truth, this is not sacred, and we walk forward towards something that is. It would be easy to believe that by the final century of the Middle Ages, the world had begun to soften, that after so much blood and silence and ruin, the people would turn inward and find within themselves some well of mercy, some memory of joy. But the truth is that by the 15th century, the mechanisms of control were not merely maintained, they had been perfected, sharpened, codified into law, into liturgy, into bone. Because when fear lives long enough, it becomes culture. And when cruelty is blessed long enough, it becomes tradition. And the most terrifying part of the final chapter was not its novelty, but its efficiency. Because now the war on the human body was not just led by popes and kings and inquisitors, but by ordinary men, by husbands and neighbors and teachers who had been raised entirely within the world of rot, who knew no other language than suspicion, who had been taught from own birth that to doubt was danger and to desire was death. And these men did not need to be told to watch, to punish, to suppress. They did it without question because they believed it was right. And so the church smiled, and the system purred, and the streets filled not with fire but with whispers. And those whispers destroyed more lives than any torch. And this was the age when the last great defenses of joy were raised, when art lost its final glimmers of rebellion, when love became not merely risky, but impossible, because the rituals had grown even darker, even colder, and the body already condemned was now treated as a weapon, as a traitor, as an object to be broken and buried rather than understood. And so came the doctrines of mortification, of extreme asceticism, where the faithful were told that salvation could only come through torment, and monasteries filled with men who had not spoken in years, whose tongues had been self-cut, who wore chains beneath their robes, who slept in coffins to prepare for death, and still the church applauded, wrote songs about them, canonized them, because a holy man who bled was better than a thinking one, and for women it was worse still, because now their silence was not enough. They were expected to be vessels of pain, to give birth in agony without medicine, to feed others before themselves, to kneel until their knees cracked, to wear veils not for modesty but for erasure. And if they failed in any of this, if they cried or touched or wanted, they were told they had invited demons into their skin. And so came the final wave of purges, not just of witches, but of the widowed, the unmarried, the barren, and each accusation was swifter than the last, and each trial more brutal. And the devices used, tongue screws, breast rippers, pair of anguish, were not invented in madness. They were invented in doctrine, in councils of men who read scripture and twisted it into blueprints for agony. And still they spoke of salvation, of purity, of love, and that hypocrisy was the most disgusting thing of all, more than the filth, more than the mutilation, more than the ruined flesh rotting in the catacombs beneath chapels, because they claimed to do it for God, because they held crosses while cutting, because they baptized pain and made it holy. And this infection spread across borders, across kingdoms, as cathedrals rose on the backs of starved builders and stained glass windows glittered with the blood of those who had dared to love in secret. And even the sky seemed to turn its back as famine returned, and plague, and war. And yet the system did not weaken, it thrived. Because in the face of death, people clung tighter to the rules that destroyed them, hoping that obedience would save them. But it didn't. It never had. And so entire generations passed without touch, without joy, without the language to even ask why. And in this silence grew myths not of monsters, but of saints who never smiled, of martyrs who died untouched, of women who bled for purity, and men who castrated themselves for heaven. And these became the ideals, the statues, the names etched into stone. And beneath those stones were the real people, the ones who touched, who loved, who were caught, who were silenced. And still, even then, in that final dusk of the Middle Ages, the truth could not be fully destroyed, because you cannot kill what lives in the blood, in the breath, in the glance between two people who see each other and know, even if they say nothing, even if they run, that something inside them still resists. And so somewhere, in the back room of a monastery, a boy carves a heart into the underside of a bench. And somewhere in a convent, a girl saves a dried rose beneath her robes. And somewhere in a forgotten village, two women braid each other's hair in the dark and call it prayer. And these small things, so small they leave no mark in history, are the only reason we remember anything at all, the only reason we survived. And so we enter the penultimate corridor of this long nightmare, the hour when the shadows stretched farthest and even memory recoiled. And in this darkness we find not monsters, but systems quiet, precise, impersonal, devastating. Because the final cruelty of the medieval X-Panic was not in its flames, but in its coldness, its bureaucracy, its ability to turn lives into parchment and pleasure into crime. And nowhere was this more evident than in the birth of confessional records. Hundreds of thousands of documents written by monks who asked intimate questions with dry hands and dead eyes, who wrote down every stutter, every tremble, every shame-soaked word, not to help, but to archive, to categorize, to punish. And these records survived unburned, bound in leather, while the bodies they described did not. And this is how we know what we know. Not from journals or letters of love, but from accusations, from inquisitions, from the meticulous notes of men who neither touched nor understood. These confessions reveal the scope, the reach, the abyss: men who admitted to impure dreams and were lashed, women who confessed to loving another woman and were sent to walk barefoot through snow until their skin came off, children who spoke of seeing angels with bodies and were called possessed, and through it all, the same refrain: that desire was evil, that X was filth, that to want was to sin, and to touch was to fall. And this message was not whispered, it was sung, carved into stone, painted above every threshold. And yet, even in its most grotesque forms, the system failed to fully erase the truth, because people kept returning to each other, even if only in secret, even if only in thought. And that persistence enraged the machine, because it exposed its failure. And so came the harsher rules, the expanded definitions, the laws that made even glances dangerous. And in some towns, husbands were told to report their wives if they were too affectionate, and fathers were told to discipline their sons for singing love songs. And the line between intimacy and treason vanished, and so people stopped speaking, stopped touching, stopped meeting each other's eyes. And in that silence, something died. Not the body, but the spirit. And in its place grew guilt. Not personal guilt, but inherited guilt. The kind that passed down generations. The kind that made people ashamed of things they never did. And this shame became the cornerstone of medieval identity, reinforced by architecture, by law, by ritual. And in this age, even the weddings were stripped of warmth. No more dancing, no more kisses, just contracts and blessings and blood. And still they called it holy. Still they said it was better this way. And meanwhile, the real joyful mutual alive was nowhere to be found, buried beneath sermons, burned with manuscripts, banished to dreams. And even those dreams became suspect. And so people trained themselves not to dream. And this was the final success of the system, not that it stopped X, but that it made people believe they didn't want it, that they never had, that they were clean only in their numbness. And yet, despite everything, the resistance endured, not in rebellion or riot, but in detail, in the way two girls shared a scarf and lingered in the touch, in the way a farmer carved initials into a tree not his own, in the way a widow smiled at a passing priest with just enough sharpness to remind him she had survived. And these were not accidents. They were deliberate, small, brave, and they mattered because they proved the doctrine had failed, because if it had worked, we would not exist. We would not love. We would not remember. We would not ask these questions. And so each moment of medieval horror we examine tonight is also a clue, a puzzle piece, in a larger map that points not to darkness, but to escape. Because for every law there was a loophole, for every priest a skeptic, for every burning a survivor. And that duality is what defines this era, not just cruelty, but the refusal to accept it, not just rot, but the hands that cleaned around it in secret. And so tonight we do not mourn, we witness, we name. We refuse to let their stories end in silence. And in that refusal we honor the truth they could not say aloud, the names they could not speak, the touches they could not complete. And in doing so, we become the record they deserved. And here, in the final fold of this long, unbroken shadow, we arrive not at the end, but at the realization that there never was a beginning or a middle in this story, only a loop, a cycle of shame and silence, repeated through bodies, through rituals, through the quiet trembling behind closed doors. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it echoing, not in the cathedrals, but in the spaces beneath them. Not in the manuscripts, but in the margins left blank, where truth was too dangerous to write. And the final cruelty of the Middle Ages was not its torture, not its fire, but the way it taught entire civilizations to flinch at themselves, to question their own desires before even feeling them, to stand before their own bodies as strangers and suspects. And in this last passage, we must speak not just of the broken, but of the broken open. Because despite all the rot, all the repression, all the suffocating scripture and scorched parchment, something still bloomed, not loudly, not cleanly, but undeniably, and that something was the refusal to forget, to collapse into obedience. And this resistance took many forms, some quiet, some sharp, some so subtle they passed unnoticed even by those who lived them, like a glance held too long, or a song hummed at the wrong hour, or a page turned back to reread a line that stirred something forbidden. And in this way, medieval people, real people, not the statues or saints left behind clues, traces, codes beneath the official scripts, and these became the veins of memory through which truth still flows. And so in our time, when we speak of medieval X, we must be precise. We must say what was hidden. That it was feared not because it corrupted, but because it liberated. Because it allowed people to feel outside the structures of control. Because it gave women power over their own longing. Because it allowed men to step outside violence. Because it let love take forms unblessed by priests. And so it was not the act that was punished, but the independence it represented. And this is why even after 1,000 years of suppression the feeling remains, not because of biology, not because of instinct, but because repression failed, and will always fail. And now, as we look back with our sterile museums and digitized texts and glossy documentaries, we must not allow comfort to rewrite truth, because these horrors were not aberrations, they were policies. And their wounds echo in laws that still exist, in attitudes that still shame, in systems that still watch. And so to end this journey is not to close the book, but to read the final line and ask, what now? What will we do with this knowledge? Will we flinch, or will we face it? Will we continue to see the body as something to fear, or finally as something to know? And the answer, if there is one, lies not in the ruins or the relics, but in the stories we tell, the language we choose, the permission we give to ourselves and to each other to feel without apology, to want without confession, to touch without fear, And that, perhaps more than anything, is what the medieval age tried to destroy. And so in reclaiming it, we win. Not with swords or sermons, but with softness, with memory, with voice. And that is why tonight we remember not to gawk, not to pity, but to honor what endured despite everything, and what will always endure, as long as we tell the truth.